All right, so the co-developer of KI, Scott, and I have known for a long time because we've developed a modality that actually resolves addiction in the body, that we were going to have to go up against the behemoth that is the 12-step community. So here we go. So for those of you who don't know, with the exception of a couple groups where you sort of define what your own version of sobriety is, the bottom line in most 12-step groups is abstinence. So it's putting down the drink or the drug or stopping the addictive behavior. And because of the compulsive and sabotaging nature of addictive drinking, using, and acting out, people usually accomplish this in 12-step by working the 12 steps of recovery with a sponsor and going to group meetings for mutual support. Some of you may know this and some not, but in the working of the 12 steps with a sponsor, which in my opinion is the most effective part of the recovery process in 12-step, a lot of initial blocks are addressed. So like resentment, guilt, fear, grievances, and a spiritual awakening is promised as a result, which will take away your desire to drink as long as you continue to work the 12 steps with other people. So here's a critique of 12-step from someone who's been through the process and several programs and has actually had to do a lot of deprogramming in order to get to the actual root of suffering in myself and begin to resolve it. Number one, step work for the most part is cognitive, right? Which means it's of the mind. The body gets left out of the process in working the steps, and the body is where the root of suffering lies, right? It's where the driver of addiction lives. What we've found in the Kiloby inquiries, and science is now echoing this, is that buried childhood emotions and the repression of them is what the mechanism of addiction actually is. Let me say it in another way. Because we don't have access to, and so can't feel or express certain buried emotions from childhood, like hurt or anger, we drink, we use, and we act out compulsively. Because we can't be ourselves fully, we turn to addiction. I always say addiction is like a surrogate parent, right? But it's like a really shitty surrogate parent. But the point is, if repression and buried emotions are being left out of the process, whatever work you're doing, whether it be in 12-step or in therapy, is ultimately going to be temporary and cosmetic. Which brings me to the next critique point, addiction hopping. I had a friend in AA who was reading a lot of Anthony DeMello, and Anthony DeMello is great. He talks a lot about approval addiction and how that's our core addiction. So my friend was sharing that in one of his AA meetings, and afterwards he had a woman come up to him and say, "I don't ever want to hear you talk about that in a recovery meeting ever again," right? This is about alcohol. This is not about approval. And if that's not a dead giveaway, that meetings, mutual support, and community are a covert, socially acceptable form of addiction, then I'm not sure what is. And here's the thing. This is what everybody does in emotional repression, right? The very aim of repressing certain emotions and suffering is to get our needs met, right? To stay safe and to get love. That's what we've been doing since we were kids. So what I might say to that lady at the AA meeting is, you've just hopped addictions from alcohol to approval, support, and encouragement, which is fine, but just know that you're leaving out the root of suffering, which if you resolved that, you wouldn't need either. And my last critique point is about identity, specifically the addict or the alcoholic identity that you take on when you come into 12-step, right? This can create a lot of confusion and ultimately can do a lot of damage, and I'll explain. A lot of people probably know the refrain from movies and TV where everybody's sitting in a circle and one person says, "Hi, I'm Steve, I'm an addict," and everybody goes, "Hi, Steve," right? So it's encouraged in 12-step to identify as, an addict or an alcoholic so that you can face the truth about yourself. The truth, of course, being that you struggle with compulsive drinking, using, or acting out, right? Well, here's the problem. Identity is the ultimate addiction, right? And people are already coming into recovery, whether they know it or not, with identities like, I'm a bad person, I'm a fuck up, there's something wrong with me. And so when they start to identify as an addict or an alcoholic, built into that particular identity, unlike the other ones that they've come in with, is a promise. And that promise is, if you come in here and identify as an alcoholic and addict and do the things that an alcoholic or addict need to do to get free, you'll get free. This is a prime example of what we in KI call a bamboozle, right? Which is looking for salvation through belief or identity, when belief and identity is what's causing your suffering in the first place and keeping you repressed. In other words, your solution becomes your problem. And you see this in addiction recovery, you see it in psychiatry, you see it in religion. Beliefs and identities are the problem, not because they're not true, but because they keep you from accessing what is true, right? Which is deeply buried anger, hurt, and fear in the unconscious body. Because that's the root of suffering and addiction, right? So with KI's emotional repression inquiry, we go straight for that, right? You don't have to be concerned with stopping or identifying as anything. In fact, during the process, if you do, we can use that, right? It can become what we call grist for the mill. So this is a long one, but it's an important one, because if you hadn't noticed, across a lot of paradigms, there's a movement or a shift from belief-based approaches to reality-based approaches. And the Kiloby Inquiries is definitely a reality-based approach. If you'd like to learn more about that, then visit repressiontest.com.